Hey everybody, welcome back. This is Emily Moyer from Off Planet Media, and Michael Wann from Susquehanna Alchemy is with me. This is episode 2 of Project Kids, and we were just kind of chattering like we do before shows and decided we better hit record because otherwise you miss the whole good part.
The best part. It's like when you just start talking in the beginning, and that's where the real interesting stuff comes out. So you were telling me about what you had discovered going through some of your mom's files when you're cleaning out her house a couple years ago.
Yeah, so let me just check my settings real fast and make sure that they're good since we're recording. They look like they're fine. Okay. All right. So, Michael was telling me, we were talking about him, what could be more dreamy than cleaning out the church that you're living in that has 50 years worth of crap in it. And I said, I'm living a similar dream as I'm cleaning out my grandmother's house that has 50 years worth of crap in it. And so he was like, did you find, what was the most interesting thing you found? So I was telling him about a couple of years ago when my dad sold our house in Chatsworth and we moved over here. I was cleaning out there, I found a lot of documents from when my mom worked for a company called Sycon, which to the best that I can confirm is a subsidiary or was a subsidiary of Tavistock. And my mother was under the impression that when she worked there, she was working on an oil project in northern Iraq. My mom later would go on to work in like the oil industry for Atlantic Richfield as a financial analyst. And I did find a few papers and documents that seemed to support that she had something to do with that. But what I really found was a treasure trove of documents about work she did for a drug dependency study while she was working there. And the drug dependency study that she was working on seemed to match up to the markers of the situation that I found myself in my life through use of psychedelics and how that sort of later connects into, how it connects to mind control programs and how it later connected into my awareness about certain methods of both detecting people who have used drugs or psychedelics and also for methods of control over them. And my mom claims to not know what I'm talking about, but there's pages and pages and pages of this and pages of her writing, like request letters to the library at Tavistock, request letters to the government, like the health department in England, because they were living in England at this time, wanting certain kinds of documents. And then some very strange letters about like the implications of her study and what they mean both for the short-term plan, but more importantly for the long-term plan. And, as people who have done a lot of research into mind control know, and particularly like some of the stuff that's been talked about here on Off Planet Radio for so long, children often end up the subjects of the experiments that their parents are working on, right? And so it sort of lent to that. So that was the big find when I was cleaning up there. So far here, my grandmother was a travel agent. And so she had a lot of interesting stuff from all over the world. She also was very fond of writing letters to senators and the president and all that kind of stuff. And back in the day, you used to get some kind of response, even if it was just uniform. So there's a lot of interesting things. One of the most interesting set of travel things that we found was a lot of stuff on Sri Lanka. She seemed to be very, very interested in Sri Lanka. And one of the things that we found, I guess, from when I was a little kid is that she had taken me to some sort of workshop. She used to take me to these things that they had at the Hollywood Bowl during the summer, during the day for kids, like cultural camps. And I do remember there was this one woman there that I at the time probably thought she was Indian, but she was probably Sri Lankan. And there was some like thing we found that was like me practicing writing the Sri Lankan alphabet, right? And what's weird about this is like about 2 years ago, somebody came into the place that I was working and asked me if I was Sri Lankan. Like literally, they walked up to the counter, asked me if I was Sri Lankan, and left. And what was weird about it was a friend of mine had jokingly said earlier that day, may some mysterious Indian man come into the restaurant today and tell you something about yourself that only you would know. And then this weird guy comes in and asks me if I don't know, I wouldn't know if I'm not sure he was Indian or not. He was definitely East Oriental, East Orient, from somewhere in the East Orient. But he literally asked me if I was Sri Lankan and left.
Who was it who put that curse on you? Was it a friend of yours?
My other half now.
Does she have a connection to projects?
Like as anybody who sort of, circulates in these circles do, there's questions, right?
Right.
Not any clear evidence or anything like that. I mean, she had just come back from India, so she was literally joking. She had been at a, like yoga teacher training kind of thing, right? But it was weird, and so from that point on, we joked that I was a Sri Lankan Jew, right? And my grandmother was Jewish, very into like the temple and all that kind of stuff. So we found this stuff of me writing the Sri Lankan alphabet, and it was like pretty weird. And there was just really extensive amounts of things from Sri Lanka. So that was kind of interesting. And then just the unusual collection. My grandmother kept everything, and she wrote lots of letters. And so there's boxes and boxes of letters. But there's also a lot of, like my grandmother went to the Soviet Union and took my dad to the Soviet Union when he was young, which, sort of lends to my suspicion of my things about my father.
What time frame? So your father
in the 60s.
So this was in the 60s, like in the height of the Cold War?
Yeah. So in the 60s.
And how old was your father at this time?
If I understand correctly, he was a teenager.
He was a teenager taken back do you have a Russian lineage?
So we definitely have a lot of Eastern European kind of Jewish thing. It's not 100% clear to me where all of it is. So it's possible. My grandmother just was she liked China. She liked Soviet Russia. So she seemed to have, she was a travel agent, which also could be a great cover for, that great, I'm half joking when I say my father's a spy and my grandmother transmitted information, because I'm half joking. But what's funny is, like, I keep finding more evidence of that.
Yeah.
Right. And so my friend Jeff Gates and I, who you met when you were on Conspiracy Cocktail, like, I started saying this, and then he started testing it to see if it actually works. Right. And I say it not because this is what I'm doing, but this is what it seems I'm doing. I make things up and they come true anyway. So I'm not making it up like, oh, I'm telling a tall tale, right? But like, I have this weird stuff. I have this idea, like, in my head, like the farthest reaches of my conspiratorial mind, that like, it's possible this is true. So like, I tell a story, I say it, and I say it in, like you, I'm a storyteller. Like, I like to tell the story about it. So I say it. And then usually within, not like the next day or anything like that, but within weeks, months, or sometimes within a year or two, I will literally find the exact evidence of, or evidence that leans strongly. I've had this suspicion about the Tavistock thing for years before I found that and whatnot. I didn't know she worked on a drug dependency study. That was like far more evidence than I expected. But it's weird. And so, there's a lot of explanations for it, I guess, if you are subscribed like I do to the fact that time isn't linear, really, then I already know this stuff because it just is a fact. It is true. Right. And so now, just because we're in this program of linearity, I'm discovering it in a chronological order, right? But there's something in me that already knows it. So anyway, so there's a lot of that. There's a lot of Soviet stuff. There's a lot of Nazi stuff, and like German stuff, Jewish stuff. And then when we were cleaning out, so that was when I was cleaning out the house a couple years ago as I moved in here. And then just when I was cleaning out the garage, I found a couple of boxes of interesting things that I haven't had a chance to go through yet. So I have those things sort of put away to take a look at, including lots of interesting like boxes of cassette tapes that I'm going to have to get a cassette tape player to try and listen to. And some of them are weird, like, by the way,
I just found like 10 cassette players in the church, so I might be able to get you one at a really good price.
All right. So stuff like that, and then like just copious letters that she has written to people, or that have like there's letters that she wrote to people. So like, why are they back here, right?
Right.
And then also letters from people in her travels all over the world, and like some of them seem to be coded. There was one like letter or diary entry about my mother and father had finally returned from their travels abroad with mission accomplished, and it said mission accomplished in parentheses. So I haven't had a chance to go through it all yet, because we were trying to get it done in a weekend and whatnot. But I put these things aside to look at, and it's just like, my dad has a PhD in African history, right? He went to UCLA and studied political science there. He then went to the law school there and got a law degree, but decided he didn't want to be a lawyer, so pursued his passion, which was African history, and became, in high school, he had been involved in a program called like a model UN, right? Like they were like modeling UN, like
I know these
like
programs,
mock court, right?
Mm-hmm.
He had been involved in that, and then when he was in the program at UCLA, his master's program for African history, he got involved in something called Project Crossroads Africa, right? And it's kind of weird. I've seen some of the papers from it. It sounds like it could be one of these sort of projects or programs that was run under the guise of an NGO, like a lot of things we see now. But he went to the university, so he got his master's at UCLA, and then got his PhD at the University of London School of African and Oriental Studies, which that particular school, that division of the University of London, the African and Oriental Studies school, has been implicated in a lot of the art that is connected to Pizzagate. So that's kind of interesting. Like somebody who I know in the community here swore forever to me that there's something funny about the thing, like this stuff that my dad had been involved in and blah, blah, blah. And eventually she found this thing about the University of London School of African and Oriental Studies in a very interesting long article about the art related, like connected to the Pizzagate scandal, right? So that was kind of interesting. So he was there, and then he lived in South Africa for a year as part of his doctorate, and went to the University of Cape Town. Many, many, many years later, my sister would decide that she wanted to get a PhD in Black Studies, and also went to the University of Cape Town and had the same advisor that my dad had, essentially, right? So I don't know if this is just, me and my mom are in the same line of the family in terms of projects, and my sister and my dad are into something else, or if it's all just a grand coincidence. It seems odd if it would be. Yeah. I'd say that my sister and my dad, through their studies in South Africa, are part of the indoctrinated intellectual left that are agitating for racial problems. They're creating racial, not that there isn't some obvious, been lots of racism in our history here, but they're creating an intellectual agitation towards this idea that everything has a basis in racial injustice, right? And we're starting to have a lot of the problems here in the United States that have been had in places like South Africa before, right? So who knows?
Is your dad Black?
No.
So he's a white guy who has a PhD in African studies. Is that correct?
White. He's a white Jewish man. Yeah. So
how common, like in a room full of 100 PhDs in African studies, how often do you see like a white Jewish man in that crowd? Is that common? I don't know.
So, when he did it, it was back in the 70s, right? And he came back here to the United States after he finished his PhD and was unable to find a job as a professor of Black studies, African studies, because this is during the time apartheid was coming to an end. So there wasn't necessarily a large appetite for what white Jewish people had to say about the struggles of Black people in South Africa, or just in general. At least this is my take on it. So he ended up working in college. He ended up doing like a college administrator kind of route, and he was a vice president of a college, and his whole life, and he also taught political science, but he never actually worked as a professor of Black studies. But fast forward a bunch of years, and my sister, she got her master, I can't remember what her bachelor's was in, but her master's was in like Pan-African studies or Black studies or something. And then there was a couple years between when she graduated with her master's from Cornell and when she went into a PhD program, because she was having trouble, even though she had done incredibly well in her master's program, getting admitted. She had a rare kind of topic she was studying. She had a little bit of a more specific thing she was looking at than my dad maybe. So she had a lot of trouble and was ultimately, it took a couple years, right? And was ultimately accepted at Howard, which is a historically Black college in Washington, D.C. So she went there and, was successful and finished her PhD. And then, it took her a little bit of time to find some work, but actually not too much. She's a professor at Emerson in Boston. And so all of these years later, there seems to be more receptivity. Maybe it's because she's a woman, right? And so that ticks off a box in terms of, that kind of thing. But she teaches at Emerson in the, I think it's like the African and Asian Studies department or something. I'm not exactly sure. And she particularly focuses on representation of Blacks in like pop culture and movies and things like that, so it's something that appeals to young people. She also teaches, and me and my sister disagree about almost everything at this point, but I do think that she is passionate about what she does and she thinks she's doing the right thing. And one of the things that she does that I highly respect is she does donate her time to teaching in prisons. And she teaches even people who are never getting out of prison. And she did it, one semester and really liked it and ended up now she's, sits on the board of this program. And I actually am familiar with some of these programs and some of them are actually really cool and really good. Some of them have, obviously certain kinds of social justice bent to them, but some of them actually do some really good stuff. And so like on a certain level, I really respect my sister and admire her. And on another level, it's difficult because we have completely different viewpoints of like, what, what's going on in the world, what's going on with this topic she's dedicated to and whatnot. But yeah, it seems like that's sort of a family, like a line of doing that kind of thing. And my mom was into oil finance and oil, she was a financial analyst for ARCO. And I kind of, not doing anything that anybody in my family did, but I'm probably in a lot of ways more like my mother in terms of the way my intellect and my intellectual interests operate. So more towards maybe some analytical, some numbers and pattern recognition and things like that, though I may be more, outgoing and creative than my mom, whereas my dad and my sister are really into, the social justice kind of thing.
Is your mom from a Jewish lineage as well?
No, my mom is German and Dutch. And then my dad is like sort of a combination of Eastern European Jewish kind of stuff, like Brooklyn Jews, not Israel Jews,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I got you. So
some similar background as you.
Well, I was going to say the number of parallels. So I'm like trying to figure out, like, as I'm listening to you tell the story, and I'm like, that's more than just oddly paralleled to like things in my story. And I'm like, so what causes it? Is this like, the same version of story in the synthetic universe? Is this just like, what is this connection? Were we both, because we had the same background, were we both brought into the similar systems? Because there's a lot of interesting similarities. I mean, going from like my parents going to China back when it was communist as well, like not in the 60s. Like I remember when my parents went to China in the early 80s. And my father's job, my dad worked, he worked for AT&T in the 70s when it was like the technology company, and he was an executive in the public relations department, but he was also the president of like some like public relations professional organization. So he traveled a lot underneath that umbrella. And that's what brought him to China. And like the whole thing, like the entire, like, you know, his career was about crafting public messages and was like the DC interface of AT&T. I grew up outside of DC. And so there was, but he would go to all of these strange places. And as I begin to, my father came from a Norwegian a Norwegian and German family. And then my mother's side was the European Jewish. So we've got that. And she's got like, you know, both my mother and father worked in, you know, seemingly normal jobs within, you know, very, very dubious organizations during dubious times.
Yeah.
And then like the other thing I want to ask you about, and I want to go to one more point before I go down, that is like the connection which you bumped up into, just like people who you know who might be like 1 degree of separation away, or maybe you're 1 degree of separation away from all of the like Project Stargate, Monroe Institute, Esalen, like that type of like 1970s type of work. Like, do you know people who are involved with that? Or like, are you like your friend's uncle or something like that?
So, I mean, so like really, obviously like the Tavistock thing is part, like the Tavistock is like where a lot of this stuff comes from. Like a lot, you know, it's if you pretty much whatever rabbit hole you go down, you're going to find connections to Tavistock. But then also just really where I grew up in Chatsworth, you know, basically that, you know, from what I understand, Chatsworth was kind of a, you know, just it's a suburb of Los Angeles, the same way Columbia was a suburb of Washington, D.C. on a certain level. And it was a coming together of certain things. So there was a lot of people working there who, like, one of the spouses worked in some sort of like technology and the other spouse worked in education. And it was almost like they were kind of looking to see, you know, like for these people to live in this community, have children, and their children would go to the schools and the summer camps there where they would have some sort of access to them. So where I grew up in Chatsworth was right there at, and I've talked about this a lot, you know, I went to this summer camp that is right up against where Rocketdyne and Boeing are. And it's where a lot of these fires have emanated from, a lot of the historical radiation, the first big radiation leak on the West Coast in the United States in Santa Susana Pass. The Manson Tunnel is right there in the park. Spawn Ranch is right there in the park that we sort of, I think you took a look at that before.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
There was a lot of these kinds of things, like all of this, like Project Looking Glass and Stargate and all this kinds of stuff. Like they started in one place, usually Stanford Research Institute or a handful of other spaces. And then I think that they were contracted out to some of these companies like Rocketdyne and Boeing, who like to have bases, for lack of a better term. These aren't manufacturing spots. They're literally in hills, right?
Yeah.
They have bases in areas that used to be Native American territory, because there's something energetic there that is different. And they're experimenting with exotic technologies of all sorts, and they're using children and, you know, in different ways, even if it's just observing when they're running some of these technologies, if it changes the behavior of the children at the local school or the local whatever. Like sometimes there's a really direct use and sometimes it's more general. And I have a really unusual array of memories. So there's that. And then the other thing for me was things I bumped up against because of my involvement in Hollywood as a child. I did some children's movies. I was in some movies as a child, including one about Judy Garland's life called Rainbow, which is like, for me, where the idea of Wizard of Oz programming, which is a mind control program, and my own life come together in a way that is just bizarre. And then the gymnastics. And so there was like 3 different things going on. So I know lots of people that have lots of connections to having been involved in these kinds of projects and programs and whatnot, and family and Hollywood business and whatnot. So yeah, like, I mean, there's all over the place for me.
So that's the common link. That's the common link. And to the point you brought up earlier, and what I was kind of joking, when you, a little bit earlier also is like, you know, what's going on? Like, undoubtedly it's through these cross connects, and you know, probably everyone who this resonates, who would watch this sort of stuff, is like, yeah, if you're resonating with it, you know, you probably were participant too, or participating also. But what we're seeing right now is like, uh you know, I don't know if it was like purposeful, like, you know, you and I are being witnessed to, like, as this is happening, or, you know, you just go through the system and like you go and you live your life, and then you're like, this is what the cause, this is what the effect is. But it's like, it's affecting the environment, like, you know, the environment which is our life environment, you know, your actual
Yeah.
waking life. So this is the one other thing I wanted to bring up, which I think is strange, and why I was asking about the African history. So Colombia was, particularly during the 70s when I grew up there, it was very much designed to be a social utopia, massaging across all racial, religious, and socioeconomic barriers. And so like that was just like the ethos of Colombia, and particularly in the 70s. And so growing up, I lived on like a cul-de-sac.
No, me
And
too. I knew you were going to say
what was your cul-de-sac's name? What
Mer-
was the name?
Merity Street.
Merity. Sleeping Dog Lane.
Oh, interesting.
So my neighbor up the street, who I was really close with, like probably from like third grade, definitely through middle school, but then probably also throughout high school. It turns out, I didn't discover this until recently, because I saw, like, I just heard from my mother. I lived on that street for like 15 years, that my friend Gina, her mother died. And so I went and I typed it up. I went to read the obituary. And this woman was, she was world renowned. She was a world renowned African studies scholar. Like she was, and so like that whole, like that, it was, and I remember growing up there, you know, like obviously I'm like the only white kid in this household over there. And I'm thinking now about like that in terms of like the energy. I remember her mom and her mom's friends would be over, and just like being in that energy. And I'm like, that's not exactly the most common sort of thing for just like, you know, some like, you know, white half Jew kid to be around, like, you know, that as an energetic level. So when you tell the story of your father, you know, and your sister, you know, it's a little bit different, but I'm like, that energy in terms of understanding, particularly an African history on a scholarly level, like that seems to be also part of this kind of unraveling which we're watching.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say that the neighborhood I grew up in was similar. That I'd say it was an experiment in multiculturalism, or things that would now become like diversity type of initiative.
Exactly.
Definitely an upper middle class. I'd say middle class to upper middle class neighborhood, depending on which block you lived on. But just the immediate neighbors, I'll just tell you, like the few neighbors around me. The neighbors next door were Chinese, or the husband was from China and the wife was from Taiwan. She worked for Litton, which was related to some of the like IG Farben kind of crap,
Yeah,
and a lot of that.
I know Litton.
I could never figure out what the husband exactly did. Like, you know, he would literally walk around the neighborhood on the backyard walls, drinking beer and just sort of peering into people's yards. It was kind of funny, right? But what I will say is, for a number of years, they rented the house out that was next to us, and very weird families would live there. And then when I moved, a little bit after I moved back, I had moved away for a while and moved back into the house after I had come to the realization of what had been going on with me my whole life. And as soon as I moved back to the house with this realization, the weird family moved out. The original owner, the Chinese guy, came back and started working on remodeling the house. And he was there all the time. And I was home a lot because I was not okay yet and whatever. But he was home a lot, and I would catch him observing me. He'd come over and knock and talk to me. And sometimes he would go take our trash out, like take our trash from our driveway and put it out on the street and do weird things like that. And I came to the conclusion that he was observing me. You know what I mean? And so I don't know if he was some kind of handler for what was going on in the neighborhood, or some kind of monitor, or an intelligence agent, whether it be for the United States or China or whatever. I don't know, and I could be totally wrong, but that was kind of my feeling. So they lived next door to the left, and then next to them was a family that was French Canadian. Both of them were Catholic. Both these families were Catholic and went to the Catholic school on the corner. There was a French Canadian family that was unusual. There was a kid, one of their children had a sleepwalking issue and used to walk down to our house in the middle of the night. And one night thought that he was coming to my house to marry me and woke up right before he rung the doorbell. But sleep paralysis, sleepwalking, a lot of this stuff goes along with some of the mind control things because you're being triggered to go out and do tasks when you think you're in bed, kind of stuff. So that was always interesting. So they were there, and then next to them was like an unusual, kind of interesting, weird family where the woman was a librarian. The kids were kind of weird, and then there was cops next to them, and the cop, a cop and a housewife. And the cop, when they moved out, they rented their house out, and they rented their house out to people in the porn industry, and they would shoot porns there. And during a particular time of like when I was coming to terms with what had happened to me, but like not yet clean from drugs and really still scared and being used some and triggered a lot, when they would have parties over there, I would be terrified to go to sleep. Like something in me was like, there's some connection between the mind control programs and what's going on in that house pornographically. I don't know, but like I would not want to sleep. I would do everything to keep myself awake, right? And later I was reading a manuscript with somebody who wrote a book about mind control, and they talked about the same thing. They talked about a similar thing happening to them, that they like were afraid that they were being taken out of their house when they were sleeping and forced to participate in some kinds of, I have no evidence of this, but for some reason I felt that way. And then hearing somebody else who's totally different than me report the same kind of thing, I was like, okay, so that's a thing. But so that was on one side. I mean, that was years later, not when I was a kid that happened. I was an adult. I was in my late 30s or early 40s by the time that happened. So that was on one side, and then there was like a couple of Korean families in the neighborhood. There was there was like a family with the guy was in a wheelchair, and the mom did everything, and that like it's just an unusual collection of families on this one cul-de-sac. And we all moved in at the same time because it was a new housing development. Right. And the other thing that was really unusual about Chatsworth, and this Randy and I talked about this in a show that'll probably come out at about the same time as this, is Ayn Rand lived in Chatsworth when she was writing Atlas Shrugged.
Wow.
Isn't that interesting? And yeah, we have some interesting little anecdotes about that. So it's a more, it's a significant place, and people probably think, oh, you just think that because you're from there. No, there's a lot of weird shit, you know what I mean, that goes on there. So it sounds like it's like a similar, these kids whose, their parents were cops, they're typical, just like white American kids would come over and play at our house, and there's all these African masks and, you know what I mean? And all my dad's kind of weird cultural stuff and whatnot. And, so it's the same thing you're talking about, right?
Oh, wow. Yeah. That is the same. And I find the Sri Lanka, what you're talking about in the beginning, interesting, because whenever I think of Sri Lanka, I always come back to that's where Arthur C. Clarke lived. The author. Yeah. So he could live anywhere, and he wrote the books that he wrote. So obviously he's like Tavistock somehow, like he's British, so there's an overlap somewhere in that network. And he lives in Sri Lanka, and he was also a pretty well-known pedophile. Yeah. And so, and I always saw it like I don't know, this is what's in my like how I'm remembering it. I don't remember why I remember it this way, but Sri Lanka also having like an important, like high elite pedophile kind of like epicenter role as well.
Yeah, that, and I think also, like I met somebody last year who worked a lot in Sri Lanka, said that there, like the women are above the men, right? It's like kind of thing, like that was sort of what I got from them, like in some weird way, like that, and then there's certain, like there's a caste system there as well, like, and have you ever looked at pictures of Sri Lanka? it looks like a psychedelic experience.
I just can think of what it looks like on a map. I don't know if I've ever actually seen like, pictures of what life looks like on it.
The colors there. Have you ever done any psychedelics? I know you did ayahuasca, but have you ever done like mushrooms?
Yeah.
All right. You know how like the colors are so vivid and it's like you don't see those same tones, even though we have pink in the real world. It's like a different tone when you see it. It's like, whoa, this is carrying a line of information that the colors we have here are not. Like something has been taken from our visual spectrum that you're re-exposed to, right? When you're on that. That's what the stuff like Sri Lanka has these crazy like pinks and greens and the temples and churches look like some of the inner cathedral kinds of things you see in like some Alex Gray kind of paintings and whatnot, right? It's very psychedelic. Yeah, so that's kind of interesting too. But yeah, I don't know. My grandma, for proportionally, I'd say like for Sri Lanka being like a fairly small country that not too many people talk about, proportionally, she had as many like souvenirs and memoirs and leftover things from Sri Lanka as she did from like China or the Soviet Union or England or any places that, are much more vast in our history of the world, in our understanding of history of the world. Right. So yeah, I don't know, to be continued, but this thing with me writing the Sri Lankan alphabet, I was just like, what?
Well,
yeah.
I mean, when you hear that, I mean, I don't know this for certain, but I'm assuming that Sri Lanka, like it falls underneath Vedic culture, right?
Yeah.
And so, and I don't know if it's how long it's been an island or when it was, connected, if it was connected to the mainland, but I would sense like that was a really special place.
Yeah. Yeah.
And desirable. And if you go and particularly if you get into like mother culture sort of like lines of like, the Celtic cultures and the Vedic cultures and the Phoenicians and like, they're all the same or have a similar sort of root. So writing the Sri Lankan language or alphabet, I don't know what that is, but I would imagine there's something very ancient in those symbols too. Well, just like writing them down, those sigils.
Yeah, like a couple of things. Do you know who Masaki Miyagawa is?
Not by name, but probably if I saw it written. I don't know how most things are pronounced.
He's been on our show several times, and he's he makes really beautiful organite pyramids. But he also
yes. Okay.
I mean, they're beautiful. They're the most immaculate, gorgeous things that you've ever seen for that kind of healing technology.
Yes.
Right. He talks a lot about the history of Japan and how it's related to Aryan culture, right? Like we've even done stuff here on Off Planet with that. And so this goes to a lot of things that he's talking about. And the obvious link is even through swastika culture, right? Mm-hmm. Like my grandmother, who was a Jewish person, has all of this Asian furniture and art that has swastikas on it, right? And when you go to India, that it's the other direction. So right. that is one of the main symbols of the connections between what you're talking about, Vedic culture, Aryan culture, and even into like Jewish culture and whatnot. It's kind of interesting. The furthest I can go out on the conspiracy realm, because this is what I like to do, right? So my thought is that my grandmother used to take me to this multicultural Children's Day program at the Hollywood Bowl here. It was there during the day that had this Indian teacher that would teach us these dances or whatever. Maybe she was really Sri Lankan. She had the little red dot and whatnot. But it's there at the Hollywood Bowl, which if anybody's ever looked at pictures of the Hollywood Bowl and its location is very clearly some kind of Stargate or portal or something like that. So maybe this is some kind of like the purpose for me being there. I don't remember there being a lot of children. I remember there just being a few. And, my grandmother was very into taking me to the Hollywood Bowl all the time. She took me to a lot of stuff when I was a kid, right? She took me to a lot of my auditions. She took me to a lot of the strange experiences that I've had related to gymnastics and to Hollywood stuff. But she would take me to things like this day program at Hollywood Bowl. She also used to take me to another place that it deeply figures into like monarch marionette programming called Bob Baker's Marionettes. So she would take me to all of these places. So if Hollywood Bowl is some kind of like portal or Stargate for internationalism or like, you know, this sort of broader, like internationalist, Vedic, symbolic kind of culture, right? That having the children learn about it there somehow connects them to it in a way that can figure into programming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's what we have to start looking at, the experiences of our actual life and our memories, with like the understanding of like, look at the rituals that happen at the London Olympics is the greatest thing, like, you know, and everyone pointed out with like the dancing,
Yeah.
and it's the rituals, acting something out is so much more significant than what we could possibly fathom.
Yeah.
And so, or I mean, maybe we could possibly fathom, but what we possibly know. So like, to go and look at your memories, like particularly what you're describing, like the outliers, like your normal experiences, which are outliers of like just the 50th percentile of human experiences in North America at this time. Like, yeah, there's probably, you got to look at it from like, what could this actually be? Because it's getting weird now.
Getting weird. And the other thing that's interesting about Hollywood Bowl is many, many years later, just about 3 years ago, I would be there one evening and have an experience that decoded a good portion of my programming for me when I went to the Depeche Mode concert there, right? It was pretty interesting. And I started to recognize I love to sort of figure out the Tavistock music culture programming kind of things.
Yeah.
It became very clear what Depeche Mode, but also just that whole genre of music, sort of in the early, you know, it started in the early 80s and into the 90s and whatever, what that was really about. Like each, you know, the different genres of music have different functions and whatnot. But I mean, you dig into the lyrics and just the aesthetic of Depeche Mode's sound.
All right.
Yeah, straight from Tavistock. I mean, if you listen to a song like, I could do it with a million songs, right? But like a really simple one to understand is go listen to the lyrics of Personal Jesus. And it is literally coding, you know, how it works when, you know, you get a task call from a handler if you're in a project, right? Like it really is, that simple, some of the songs, but they're tremendously creative and they have an aesthetic and a vibe all their own. And we personally relate it to periods of time in our life.
Uh-huh.
And it's very, I did a show with Randy right after I'd been to the concert where we talked about this, you know, and it was like, wow, like I didn't like, I always liked Depeche Mode, but I was never like super obsessed with them or anything like that. I liked the music, but I hadn't really paid close attention to the lyrics before, even though I listened to that stuff a lot as a kid. And so I'm sitting there at 42 years old or 41 going, holy fucking shit, this is like some serious, like, you know, both things in their music. There's like really direct, obvious lyrics, and then there's a lot of like what's called twilight language.
Yeah.
You know, in there. And it was just like, wow. And just the way that music makes you feel and the sort of mood that it brings up and whatnot. Like I remember it took me back to that period of time in my life. It was like, okay, like I can now see where some of the lines of programming were coming. Some are obvious and others are not so obvious. And so but that happened there at the Hollywood Bowl also. And if time doesn't exist, you know what I mean? Then Hollywood Bowl becomes like or if time is different than what we understand it, like a place where like so much history is stored because of the different things that happen there that is accessible at any time from any angle, right?
Yes.
Yeah. It's like a tool that's downloaded all the memories of the people who ever touched it or something, you know?
I mean, you hit a couple of really interesting things. Like part of me wants to go down the Depeche Mode, but there's this other thing which I want to talk specifically about time, because this just happened last night.
Okay.
All right. So, so I had an unusual sleep experience last night, and I think I'm pretty good at recognizing my experiences relative to my own experience. So it's like, you know, I can compare my sleep last night to like how I know my sleep is. I pay attention to stuff. So I have really, really well-defined 3-dimensional navigation. And what I mean by that is like, I always know what time it is, and I always know exactly where I am. That's three-dimensional programming.
Me too. Yeah.
So, and one of the ways which I'm really good is like whenever I wake up, if in the middle of the night, if I'm asleep and then I wake up, I look at what time it is. Like I just
Okay.
look at my bed.
This is going to be incredible if this is the same thing that happened to me a few nights ago. Go ahead.
So like I do that. Like that's kind of like what I do. And sleep is like I've got a really strange an unusual relationship with sleep. But anyway, so last night I'm sleeping and I know what it feels like, the amount of time between when I look at a clock. Like I don't look at it like obsessive compulsively, but I do it like, you know, a couple times throughout the night. I know what it feels like between looks. And what felt like literally 90 minutes to 2 hours was 3 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And it happened to me. It kept happening to me last night. And I've never had this experience where I felt like what I feel in my body time, but then what I know in my like three-dimensional navigation, how much time has transpired linear, and they've been totally off.
Yeah, I go through stuff like that. I had something happen. I think it was either 2 or 3 nights ago. I was out of town. We were in Arizona, and I woke up. I'm like you, right? I sometimes I'll wake up and if I wake up to go to the bathroom or whatever, I look at the time. And I tend to wake up at the same time just about every night to go to the bathroom, right? It's usually, and then I usually will go back to sleep I usually wake up sometime between 4:45 and 5, go to the bathroom, and then maybe I'll come back and sleep for another hour, and then I'll get up, right? Mm-hmm. So I woke up, I went to the bathroom, I come back, I look at the clock, it's 4:55. I get back in bed for what seems like my hour I get back in bed from. I roll over and I look at the clock and it's 4:10. Right? And so it's, my cat is questioning this as well here. Right. So it's like, right. You know, I was out of town. I do tend to have more time anomalies when I'm traveling than when I'm at home. You know, but I was in the same time zone. So, you know, but like it was very clearly 4:55 because I thought about not getting back in the bed. Whenever I wake up between 4:45 and 5, sometimes I'm like, I can get up and get my running done early this morning. Do I want to do that? Sometimes I do it. Occasionally I do, but a lot of times I go back to sleep. So I thought about it for a second. Do I want to go for a walk? Do I want to, you know, I'll get back in bed for a little bit. And then 4:10 when I get up the next time. And I was like, okay. So there is something funny. And also I had some days where it was like the days felt long. We did all this stuff and it seemed like it would be like 7 o'clock, but it was only like 2:30 or 3.
Yes.
You had any of that?
Yeah. There's definitely some weird time related things that are happening.
How much technology were you looking at that day or the day before or the day after?
Well, I'll tell you what's weird about it or what's unusual. Do you know what an earthing mat is? Like the sleep mats?
I have one right over there. Yeah.
So is it plugged into the ground or is it through the ground of your electrical? Like, do you have the rod that goes out the window or do you just plug it into an outlet?
The electrical outlet.
Okay. So that's how I've always had it. Yeah. And I just got the one which goes out into the ground.
Okay.
Okay. The only difference is like, you know, this isn't like running. It shouldn't theoretically, like it definitely doesn't do anything. You can go test and you can see like, you know, if it's a properly functioning earthing mat, you're going to have like no voltage, but still does like go over the infrastructure of your electrical of your house. You know, I don't know what that means, but so for whatever reason, so the night that happened was the first night, the only night I've ever slept with the grounding rod in the ground. So right. I don't know if that has anything to do with it.
Well, that's interesting. Okay, so a couple of things. The reason I asked about the technology was because during this whole time of lockdown, right, like we've been, like it's more severe here in Los Angeles than it is other places. So there really is like, you know, I've spent much more time on the computer than I normally would. You know, I go out and exercise and I do a lot of other stuff, but like I'm not a person who loves being in front of the computer, you know, so I've spent more time. And for a couple of days when I traveled, it was not until like the last day before I came home that I opened my computer and looked at it and looked at Facebook or anything because I needed to take care of something, right? So I was separate from the technology. So I start, like, whenever I'm separate from the technology, I start to have a looser relationship with time, right? Like, it isn't so focused. That was why I asked you, but what you just said about the grounding thing, I watched a documentary not that long ago about earthing with the guy tying the thing around his toe and putting it outside and whatever. It was kind of interesting. And then he talked about you could do it in the house too. But I have two. I have like a regular grounding mat that I'm not sure where it came from. And then I have a grounding thing that I got from Sophia Small Storm that is like just like a patch that you can touch to anywhere in your body that's plugged into those kinds of things. But they're both the same kind of thing. Do you know about lily waves?
It sounds familiar, but I'm not certain what they are.
Okay, so lily waves have to do with the electrical wiring in your house. And it's a technology or a frequency that is associated with John Lilly. Do you know who John Lilly is?
I was just reading about him today.
Okay, like he's one of the people I really want to dive deep into. He has some fascinating sounding books, but he was the creator of the TV series Flipper, but also the creator of anechoic chambers that are now known as float tanks. And this idea of he was involved in a lot of the mind control kind of circles, right? The Estalin people of this and that, this idea of using sensory deprivation for achieving altered states, right? And so the lily waves are also a technology associated to things that he did. And they have to do with mind control for sure. Like literally, like when I was still doing drugs, like I would have these experiences where I could literally see like some sort of weird black nanotech particle stuff coming out of the electrical outlets and off of the wall. And the only reason I'm even willing to say that out loud is because I've had conversations with people who never did drugs, who had the same experience, who've had it happen to them. So, okay. I used to sit there, like, it would tend to happen when I was like, I'd been up partying for a couple of days, but I was calming down. I was trying to go to sleep, and I'm laying on my bed and having trouble falling asleep. And I would literally see this stuff coming off the walls. And my cat would sit there and look at it with me. And you know how cats can see all the stuff we can't see? And it was just weird. I would feel like it was coming off of the bed towards me. And this guy that I talked to for a while years ago, like, he also has some sort of, relation to this stuff in his background. He was obsessed with these lily waves and this black particle tech. You know what I mean? He used to send me information on it and stuff like that. It's weird, like some kind of particles that are respondent to that. I've also seen some of those kinds of particles in some of the lower lying chemtrails sometimes that almost look like, do you remember Magnadoodle or Etch-a-Sketch?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it would seem like that, like there would be this like black particles that were sort of floating around in the air, and then they would start to coalesce sometimes into like some sort of form or shape. And my thought was like, I wonder if this is some sort of like magnetic particle that entities can kind of attach themselves to, or energies or something, right? So
let me ask you real quick about the chemtrails. You know,
yeah.
Sometimes they seem to be like shadows.
Yes.
They're chemtrail shadows. You're like, why is there a shadow on top of the white cloud of the chemtrail?
It's that stuff.
That's that. Yes, it's that stuff.
Right.
Yes.
So some people will say, oh, it's coal ash, and they use that for cloud seeding, whatever. But why is coal ash behaving like magnetic particles?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like literally one time I was on this back road between Chatsworth and Ventura where my mom lives. And like these particles felt like and this was after I was, clean and whatever. These particles were like following my car. Right? Like they were like a couple, like maybe, I don't know, it's hard to say, somewhere between 40 and 100 feet up. Sometimes it's hard to tell, whatever. But it was like they were blowing with something that was like following my car. And it was like they were in, how like birds will create a formation when they're flying, or planes. It was like kind of like that. And it's in an area where a lot of like spraying goes on, and a lot of weird, like unusual aerial vehicles kinds of things are spotted. So I don't know how it's related to that, but it may be. But these lily waves also affect your body based on blood sugar. Like these lily waves can cause like blood sugar explosions in your body that almost act like time crystallization events. My friend Danny Katz found like a really good article about that. I have to see if I can find it again. Right? So and you're talking about your grounding, like those things are in the wall. They're wired. The lily waves are part of the electrical wiring in your house that started like, I think sometime in the 50s or 60s, maybe it was the 70s. And so you're having these weird time experience while your grounding mat is plugged now outside. So it's just something, you know, different, right? Like maybe that's the normal experience and the one that you've been having is different. That's
yes.
Because of the lily waves.
Well, I don't know if it's caused the lily waves, but my sense was there's a difference in terms of what I'm being bathed in, if you will.
But it would still be whether, like, even though, like, sure, like there's the grounding element, but if it's in that same outlet that wiring has these waves running through it.
Exactly.
It's got to affect it somehow. So
it has to. Exactly. That's what makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah. So that's interesting. But I have that sometimes. Like, do you ever have where you'll wake up and it's like 3:24 or 4:23, and then you go back to sleep and you wake up and it's 3:24, like some period of time later too, where the numbers are the same but rearranged? You ever had that one?
I don't think so. I've got a very like I've been really strongly aligned to the rational side of numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Like I can float away from it, but like I don't have that much like fluidity like what you're describing. Like you got to like going forward and backwards. Like that's not like outside of my realm of like, oh, that can't happen. I'm just like, okay, that's not my relationship. Mine is much more orderly. And like, I think mine has been grounded very much like that. At the same time, like something else was let really far out.
Yeah, the order of numbers may be part of your anchor so that the other things can be fluid.
Yes. So I don't have like what you're having, like, you know, going back and forth with time and sensing that, or like, as we talked about last time, go into the portals in the financial districts.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's very similar. We can begin to understand what each person has, like how they kind of work with the what do we call it? I mean, the Project Kid world, like, you know,
how they sort of work with whatever their extrasensory ability or perception or whatever.
Yes, exactly.
It has to be grounded in something. And like, so for me, like one of my things is like, I'm always hungry. I'm a person that's like always hungry, no matter what happens, like something that makes other people lose their appetite or whatever, I'm hungry. So for me, like the food is part of what keeps me grounded so that my feet stay on the ground while my head goes into all these other spaces, right? So like that's one for me, right? Like, and I like a lot of salt, which is also very grounding. Like people are like, how can you not have high blood pressure, all the salt that you eat, whatever. But for me, that like helps keep me grounded, and having an orderly relationship with numbers, you know, might be something like that. But I too have that thing that you're talking about where, like I always know like where I am, and within just a few minutes, generally what time it is. Very rarely do I not. Every once in a while, some surprise happens like that in terms of time. But like when I was a kid, like my mom would get lost. I'd be like 5 or 6. She'd get lost when we were driving and I'd find the way home. Right? Like that kind of stuff. Have you always been like that? Like no matter where you are, you know how to get home from there. You have some sense that it's like, even in a new city, like, no, I just feel like it's this way. It's not that way. You too?
I do that. Like I have a good sense of direction, but there's one place where it's very acutely developed, and that is inside of buildings. Mm-hmm. If I ever go into like a mall or a grocery store or anyone's house, I can recall with total with very accurate detail where everything is relative to everything else.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
So I've got that. Like I'm good with directions and I'm good with roads, but that that seems to be very uncommon. Like that's part of the grounding or part of the training. Who knows?
That's also part of intelligence asset work, though. Intelligence,
exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
For me too. Like I can generally, I have an incredible memory for a lot of things, but what you're talking about is really important if you're gathering information either for yourself or for someone else to get in and out of a place very quickly or without being noticed, right? You know, that kind of thing, like knowing where everything is so you don't have to make any stops, so you can get in and out of the building before the alarm goes off.
Whenever, in movies, like you'll see that bumped up every once in a while, like heist films or like the Jason Bourne films, where they talk about, you'll see a character who notices everything, every single person. Like there's been, whether naturally or it was grown, that is strongly developed within my mind.
Yep. Yeah. Did you ever see that movie, The Salton Sea, with Val Kilmer?
Mm-mm.
So he plays in it, like he's posing as a meth addict so that he can get a job as an informant, so that he can bust the cops, the dirty cops that were involved in like a situation that got his wife killed. Okay. And so he's posing as a meth addict. So he's doing meth, but he's also like informing for the cops, right? And like he would go into these places and just see, like, pick up little details that you're watching the movie and like you just totally didn't see it all. But when they'd go back because he'd pick them up, it's like, okay, they'd show it from a different angle, and he was like literally able to see around the corner in the bathroom behind the door that they're, you know what I mean? Like he was very good at this kind of, which is something that actually meth accentuates some of, you know, there's a lot of terrible things about meth, and it's probably mostly what people do to themselves when they're on it. But there is definitely an extension of your senses that happens with it. That is why it's been used that's why Hitler used it. You know, that's why a lot of people who it's been used extensively in projects and programs and in the military and stuff like that. But he was like, you know what I mean? He could scope out not only the areas that he would go to, but just like things that like, he was good at like looking around the corner kind of thing, right? Like, it was kind of fascinating. Val Kilmer is in interesting movies. I like to, like you sort of do with you were telling me about with Keanu Reeves and whatever. Like I look at the arc of their career, the choices that they've made, and I look at the bigger picture, the bigger story they're telling us than just the topics of the movies. He's definitely one of those.
Well, when you say that, I remember, I don't know if you can recall early Val Kilmer, but I believe his breakout role was in the movie Top Secret.
Top Secret? Yeah.
You remember that? From the 80s? Like he's probably like a 20-year-old like pinup actor at the time. And he's like, he's like a cross between a comical James Bond. Like he was funny, like maybe like Mr. Bean, but he was really good at being a spy. But yeah, he was always involved with spycraft from the beginning.
He was in the movie about cold fusion called The Saint.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
He's been Batman. Salton Sea watch Salton Sea. That is layered thick with so many fascinating
things. Right, I'll watch Salton Sea. I'll write that down.
He was Jim Morrison in The Doors.
Yes.
Right. And guess where he's from?
Val Kilmer, Chatsworth.
You got it.
I'm good at that game. Like password.
Right. Yeah. So, you know, I like that idea that like those of us that have some of these like expansive abilities in terms of stretching our imagination or our consciousness or becoming really flexible or loose with certain aspects of what we think is like 5 sense reality, that we have one or two of them that is really grounded and solid so that the others can stretch. But you can find, it's sort of like a way to come back, right?
Yeah. I mean, I certainly don't have the eating one. Like if people if people don't feed me, like I don't eat. Like it doesn't occur, like it's like outside, like that doesn't feel natural to me. Like, I mean, obviously I'm in a body and I want to eat, but that's not like that's not where my grounding happens. Like and I think that's part of it as well, is recognizing like where you need the assistance. And are we doing a second hour? Is that how we're going to do this like we did before?
Yeah, I think we should like wind down this one and then
because there's some stuff I want to talk about in the second hour, and this is kind of like a good segue, which is going back to like more practical applications of some of these things that we're discovering, and particularly as it relates to right now, and you know, as the next wave is beginning to take form.
Awesome. That sounds good. All right, guys. So if you want to join us for the second hour, that's it. Patreon.com/offplanetmedia. You can find Michael at susquehannaalchemy.com. Yes. Starboard.
There, Susquehanna Alchemy on YouTube or Susquehanna Alchemy at Subscribestar.
Awesome. All right. And you all know where to find me. It's right here on Off Planet Media. You can find me on the Off Planet Media YouTube channel, as well as the Emily Moyer YouTube channel, where this will go first, and it will go to Off Planet after that. We will see you next time. Join us on the other side for the rest of the show. All righty. Cool.